before the first crown was contested, before the first banner was raised against another banner of the same blood. The Telkesir carried a dangerous certainty. That time itself was their ally. They had watched coastlines wander and mountains weather down, and still called the forests home. They built realms that felt eternal because their people were, for all mortal purposes, close enough. If you would share where you listen from, your city, your coast, your quiet inland place, leave it in the margins of these chronicles. And if these candlelit pages hold you, lend your name to this channel, so the record continues to be opened. Then let the old years speak. The Crown Wars were not born from a single betrayal. They were born from a slow reshaping of what elves told themselves was order. In elder centuries, elven realms in the great northern woods did not think like nations in the mortal sense. Paths were sacred. Glades were shared by covenant. A coronal's authority was real, but it rested on consent, tradition, and the patient gravity of high magic that bound a realm to its land. Then ambition learned to dress itself as virtue. In the northern forests, Arivandar rose as a brilliant sun-elf power, its courts polished and confident, its banners carried with the easy assumption that greatness was proof of right. Their nobles did not merely want security, they wanted primacy. One lineage in particular, House Vishan, became infamous in later accounts, not because they marched at the head of every host, but because they shaped the reasons hosts were raised at all. They built influence through marriage and patronage, elevated allies into key councils, and argued that a stronger Arivandar would protect all elvenkind from disorder beyond the trees. In their hands, pride became doctrine, and doctrine became logistics. Roads surveyed, garrisons planned, and protection discussed, as if it were already owed. To understand why crowns mattered, you have to strip the word of romance. A crown in these wars was not simply metal and gems. It was the claim that one coronal's vision should define the future of the people. In Arivandar, unity began to mean consolidation. Other realms brought under proper guidance, their borders treated as temporary misunderstandings. Elsewhere, unity still meant balance. Different realms keeping different vows, each guarding a piece of the living world, each honoring the Seldarine in its own way, and each wary of any realm claiming to speak for all. That difference sounded philosophical. It was political, and then it became lethal. South and west of Arivandar lay realms that had no wish to become provinces in another court's dream. Mayeritar, remembered for its artistry and its closeness to moon elf traditions, guarded forests and high places that were not resources but sanctuaries of identity. Chantel Othrayer held a legacy older than any one dynasty's hunger, ancient sites and settlements whose value could not be measured in timber or acreage. Across the wider woodlands, other elven courts watched with careful eyes. Some feared Arivandar's rise, others hoped appeasement would spare blood. A few quietly wondered how to survive if the North truly marched. The second truth is harder to accept. The earliest pressure did not begin as open hatred. It began as corrections. Arivandar pressed outward with the language of law, claims of stewardship, demands that neighbors recognize rightful authority, arguments about ancient prerogatives delivered with smiling courtesy. Border incidents followed. Patrols clashed. A sacred grove was misunderstood, then occupied. A road was secured, then taxed. When other realms resisted, they were accused of endangering elvenkind's future by clinging to old divisions. Only later did elven chroniclers speak of these opening years as the first of the Crown Wars. The name sounds like a single proclamation, But the truth is smaller and worse. A chain of decisions, each one defensible in isolation until the chain could no longer be broken. In those first years, elders in more than one realm believed restraint would prevail because restraint always had. High magic was more than power. It was a covenant with consequence. To shape weather, to anchor enduring wards, to raise protections that could outlast dynasties, these were acts that carried spiritual weight. Even war, in older elven memory, had limits. Battles could be fought without tearing the land's heart. Rivals could be humbled without being erased. But the crown wars were a test of whether a people that lives for centuries can still fear what it becomes. Once blood is spilled between kin, the question is never only who struck first. The question becomes what you will do to make sure you are not the one who bleeds last. Arevandar's expansion met organized resistance, and resistance met escalation. Courts that had traded envoys began to trade accusations of corruption. Priests and mages were drawn into politics until every rite felt like a declaration. Even families within a single realm began to split along the fault line of ambition. Those who believed expansion was destiny, and those who saw it as a violation of ancient vows. Here lies the pivot that hardens everything that follows. At first, campaigns could still be explained as disputes over land and influence. Then the language shifts. Opponents are no longer simply rivals. They become threats to tradition, obstacles to true elven order, dangers that must be removed for the sake of the people. When war stops being about territory and becomes about identity, compromise does not merely fail, it becomes suspect. Peace is recast as weakness, and mercy as naivety. In that moment, the crown wars stop being a contest of borders and become a contest over what an elf is allowed to do to another elf. And so the wars spread like a fire that refuses to die. Elven warriors are patient. Elven grudges can be patient too. Seasons of marching became decades. Decades became long memories. Smaller realms were forced to choose alliances, not because they loved their allies, but because neutrality became impossible. The forests themselves, once a shared inheritance, began to feel like contested scripture, every boundary marked by grief and guarded by memory. Yet even in this darkness, the most tragic element is not the cunning of generals. It is the slow acceptance of extremes. The crown wars taught the Tel'Qussir to reach for solutions earlier ages would have feared. Not all of that is visible in the earliest chronicles, because elves are careful with shame. But you can see it in what disappears from their speech. The old assumption that another elven realm is still, at root, family. By the time the crown wars are recognized as a single era rather than a handful of necessary conflicts, the damage is already woven into elven society. A crown has become more than a symbol. It has become permission. And once permission is granted, the unthinkable stops being unthinkable. It becomes policy. The first blood did not end the argument. It only made the argument permanent. In Arevandar, the war's earliest victories were not measured in miles of conquered forest, but in something quieter. The changing shape of what the North claimed was reasonable. When House Vishan spoke of unity, they did not speak like raiders. They spoke like caretakers. They invoked ancient precedents, the weight of lineage, the responsibilities of a great realm toward lesser ones. They taught their allies to say the same words until those words began to feel like reality. Across the woodlands, other coronals heard the message and understood its true edge. If Arevandar was allowed to define unity as submission, then every independent realm was living on borrowed time. Mieretar felt this pressure first and most intimately, because it sat within the web of routes and ambitions that Arivandar needed to control to make its dream stable. In later retellings, Mieretar is often remembered for what was done to it at the war's height. But before the catastrophe, Mieretar's role was simpler and more tragic. It was a mirror held up to Arivandar's doctrine. Mieretar's moon elf traditions were not a rebellion. They were a refusal to accept that greatness required domination. It was a realm built on craft, song, and patient guardianship of living places that did not belong to any throne. That refusal was treated as provocation. Chantel Othrayer, older in some ways than Arivandar's rising pride, stood with similar stubbornness. It was not a realm that needed to expand to prove itself. It already carried ancient sites, places where elven memory clung to stone, where high magic had left marks that were not trophies, but warnings. To Chantel Othrayer, Arivandar's language of consolidation sounded like a young noble speaking too loudly in a temple. The first great shift of the Crown Wars is this. Disagreement became suspicion, and suspicion became moral accusation. Arivandar's court increasingly framed resistance not as political opposition, but as a kind of disloyalty to elven destiny. Those who would not accept the North's guidance were portrayed as decadent, disordered, even dangerous, realms whose independence threatened to fracture the people in an age when humans and other short-lived folk were spreading, multiplying, building. It was persuasive because it carried a seed of truth. The world was changing. Elves could feel it, as they always could, in the movement of borders and the noise of younger kingdoms. Fear does not need to be false to become poisonous. In response, the realms who feared Arivandar began to do something elves had long avoided. They began to think in coalitions rather than kinship. That change did not begin with banners and oaths shouted before armies. It began with cautious meetings, quiet envoys, agreements wrapped in formal pleasantries, each side pretending they were only discussing border stability, when everyone understood they were discussing survival. A second revelation follows close behind the first. The Crown Wars were not merely Arivandar against everyone else. Elves did not divide neatly into one righteous side and one corrupt one. Courts and councils within multiple realms argued bitterly over what to do about the North. Some urged accommodation, believing that war among elves would be the greater disaster no matter the outcome. Others argued that accommodation was the disaster because it taught Arivandar that pressure worked. Families split. Orders of mages split. Even among the faithful of the Seldarine, there were those who believed the gods would not permit elves to destroy one another on a grand scale, and those who feared that the gods might watch in silence until a line was crossed. That line was not crossed in a single spell. It was crossed in a pattern of decisions that made the next decision easier. When negotiations failed, Arivandar's ideology demanded a new explanation. A realm that insists it is rightful cannot easily admit it is resisted for good reason. So it begins to say that resistance is unnatural, that opposing coronals have been misled, that traditions are outdated, that the old vows must bend for the greater order. Once those claims are accepted, it becomes possible, almost inevitable, to justify interventions for the realm's own good. Armies marched under that logic. Border holdings were seized under that logic. Local disputes were escalated into proofs that Arivandar's neighbors were unfit to manage their own lands. Here, in the middle of this long, tightening spiral, the wars find their anchor. The moment elven statecraft embraced the idea that culture itself could be conquered. It is one thing to take a road, or demand tribute, or enforce a treaty at spear point. It is another to insist that songs, rites, and identities must be corrected. Yet in this era, that second impulse took root. Arivandar's expansion was not only territorial, it pressed for influence over councils, marriages, and succession. It encouraged sympathetic factions in other realms and treated those factions as legitimate voices of true elven order, whether the realm itself agreed or not. And once internal factions became instruments of foreign policy, peace became almost impossible. Because now even a truce did not resolve the problem. A truce simply became time. Time for influence to grow. Time for councils to tilt. Time for coronals to be replaced by more compliant heirs. Other realms adapted because they had to. They hardened their own courts. They watched their own nobles for signs of Arivandar's reach. They began to view diplomacy not as a shared ritual between kin, but as a battlefield of different kind, where each word might carry a hidden blade. A third truth surfaces here, one that later ages often misunderstand. Elven patience made these wars worse. A human war might burn hot and end because mortals cannot afford decades of marching and loss. Elves could afford it. Not economically, not emotionally, but temporally. Their lives were long enough to sustain grudges and policies beyond a single ruler's lifetime. They could prosecute a conflict the way a tree grows, slowly, relentlessly, filling every available space. So the crown wars expanded through momentum as much as malice. To the south, another great elven realm watched all this with a colder gaze. Elithir. Even before its fate is spoken aloud in later chronicles, its presence shapes the early crown wars like a shadow at the edge of the firelight. Elithir was powerful, proud, and capable of cruelty in ways that unsettled even other elves. It was not a passive observer of a northern struggle. It had its own ambitions, its own rivalries, and its own understanding of what it meant to win. The existence of Elithir changed the calculus for everyone. It turned Mieritar into more than a neighbor. It made it a buffer between titanic powers and incompatible visions of elven supremacy. It made Arivandar's hunger more urgent and more reckless, because influence in the central forests could determine who would be surrounded and who would be secure. It made alliances feel not merely prudent, but necessary. By the time elven chroniclers speak of these years as the true beginning, when the crown wars became an era rather than an argument, something essential had already been lost. The people still spoke of unity. They still invoked ancient names. They still attended rituals and sang hymns. But beneath the ceremony, they had accepted a new premise, that an elven realm could be corrected by force, and that correction could be called justice. That single premise is the seed from which every later horror grows. There is a moment in every long war when the living stop believing it will end and begin living as if it is the natural climate of the world. For the Telkesir, that moment came early, because their first shock was not the sight of elven dead, but the realization that elven courts could grow accustomed to it. Arivandar's ambition did not stall when it met resistance. It evolved. What began as pressure along borders became a doctrine of inheritance, the claim that the North's rightful authority was older than any neighboring realm's refusal. In the polished halls of Arivandar, this argument was not delivered with rage. It was delivered with calm, almost holy certainty. That tone mattered. A sword arm grows tired. Certainty does not. And so the early crown wars deepened into something more structured. Not merely raids, Not merely punitive marches, but prolonged campaigns meant to reshape the map and the mind at the same time. Garrisons were planted where old paths had once been shared. Protective levies became permanent obligations. Local leaders who resisted were replaced by those who would speak in Arivandar's language. It was governance by conquest, disguised as guidance. The first quiet revelation the later ages wrestle with is this. Many elves, even outside Arivandar, found the doctrine tempting. Not because they loved tyranny, but because the world beyond the forests was becoming louder and more crowded. Humans multiplied. Dwarven halls endured. Orc hordes surged and retreated and surged again. To an elf who had watched centuries of slow change, the speed of mortal expansion could feel like a kind of approaching storm. Arivandar exploited that fear. It did not need to persuade every realm to surrender. It only needed to persuade enough influential voices that resistance seemed stubborn, even irresponsible. If the people were to endure, the argument went, they must be unified. If they must be unified, someone must lead. If someone must lead, why not the realm strong enough to bear the burden? These ideas did not sound like villainy in the mouths of courtiers. They sounded like duty. Mayeritar and Chantel Othrayer understood the trap. They had their own strength, but their strength was not a hunger to rule. It was an older kind of resilience, the patience of established rights, the authority of place, the knowledge that high magic was not a tool for politics, but a sacred art whose misuse carried consequences beyond any victory. So they resisted not only Arivandar's armies, but Arivandar's definitions. That resistance forced a second evolution. If conquest could not be framed as benevolent stewardship, then the opposing realms had to be framed as corrupt. Arivandar's rhetoric hardened. The language of misguided cousins began to shift into language of dangerous dissidents. The difference is not semantic. It is the difference between family quarrel and ideological purge. In this atmosphere, alliances became more than strategy. They became statements of identity. To stand against Arivandar was to declare that no single crown could speak for the people. To accept Arivandar's protection was to declare that tradition must bend to survival. And then a third truth surfaced, one that did not begin in Arivandar at all. Elithir did not merely watch, it moved. Even among elves, Elithir carried a reputation for practices and philosophies that other realms treated with unease. Its power was real, and its ambitions were not hidden behind gentle words. In the widening chaos, Elithir's leaders could see what others could not yet admit, that the center of the elven world was becoming a corridor of vulnerability. If Arivandar could spread influence through doctrine and marriage, Elithir could spread influence through fear and opportunism. Between these forces, Mayeritar became a critical hinge, not because it sought to be, but because geography and politics made it so. It stood near the fault lines. It was close enough to be pressured from more than one direction. It was culturally distinct enough to be portrayed as other by those who needed a scapegoat. And it was proud enough to refuse to become anyone's buffer state. This is where the crown wars begin to feel less like a sequence of battles and more like a spiritual illness. Elves who had once trusted the shared sanctity of the forests began to fortify them against one another. The people still spoke of the Seldarine, still sang the old hymns, still celebrated rites tied to moon and season. But now those rites were performed under watch. The mid-era anchor, the turning point that redefines everything that came before, was not a single massacre. It was the beginning of the retreat. The retreat is often spoken of in later centuries as a grand cultural withdrawal, a turning away from the world of mortals toward Evermeet and other sanctuaries. But in the era of the Crown Wars, it begins as a confession of dread. Some elven communities looked at the spreading conflict and decided that the war itself was proof that the people had lost their path. They could not stop Arivandar. They could not trust Ilithir. They could not even trust their own councils to stay uncorrupted by fear. So they chose distance. This was not cowardice in the simple sense. It was despair given policy. It was the belief that separation was the only way to preserve what remained unbroken. Whole enclaves began to withdraw from contested lands. Some moved west toward safer coasts. Some sought hidden vales and protected places. Some looked across the trackless sea and began to dream of a refuge far from the reach of rival crowns. And here lies the cruel irony. The retreat, meant to preserve elven identity, also weakened the very realms still trying to resist conquest. Every community that stepped away left behind less manpower, fewer mages, fewer elders to hold the line of tradition. The war did not simply kill, it hollowed. Arivandar interpreted this hollowing as confirmation. If others withdrew, then the North's doctrine of consolidation looked more necessary than ever. The realm could say, with cold confidence, that it was only taking responsibility for lands abandoned by weaker wills. In that justification, seizure became stewardship again. Meanwhile, Ilithir read the same hollowing differently. To Ilithir, withdrawal was weakness. It was opportunity. It meant fewer witnesses, fewer restraints, fewer counterweights. In the growing darkness, some of the most frightening choices were not made on battlefields, but in private councils where leaders concluded that the old rules no longer applied. Elves began to speak quietly at first, of ending threats permanently. That is the last subtle shift before the calamities that later generations can name without flinching. When a people decides that permanence is an acceptable military goal, the methods inevitably follow. And because elves are long-lived, their capacity for permanence is terrible. They can plan not for a season, but for centuries. They can shape consequences that outlast remorse. By the close of this phase of the Crown Wars, the conflict had accomplished something no enemy of the elves could have achieved from without. It had turned their greatest strength, time, into a weapon against their own unity. It had pushed some toward dominance, others toward withdrawal, and still others toward darker calculations. And a final, newly contextualized truth settles like ash. The Crown Wars were not only fought over land, they were fought over the meaning of elven civilization itself, whether it would be guarded by shared vows, ruled by a single crown, or remade by whatever power was willing to do what conscience once forbade. Once the Crown Wars found their rhythm, even the seasons began to feel enlisted. There were still councils, still envoys, still the careful, formal language elves used when they wanted to believe they were civilized in the old way. But behind every polished phrase sat the same unspoken fact. Armies were already moving, and decisions were being made by those willing to act first. Arivandar's doctrine hardened into something that could survive setbacks. When a campaign stalled, the North did not interpret it as a warning. It interpreted it as proof that resistance had been allowed to grow too bold. So the strategy shifted from pressure to dismantlement, isolating realms one by one, cutting them away from allies, and forcing choices that felt less like politics and more like triage. A small, terrible revelation followed from that shift. The wars were no longer fought only at borders. They were fought at crossroads, in treaties, in succession lines, and in the private chambers where nobles decided whether their children would marry for love, for tradition, or for survival. In those years, Chantal Autrayer became a lesson written in living wood and ancient stone. Some sources treat Chantal Autrayer as one of the elder pillars of elven civilization in the north, an inheritance of old settlements and sanctified places that had endured long before Aravandar's rise to preeminence. Others describe it more as a web of holdings and sacred sites rather than a single tightly bound realm. The distinction matters less than the outcome. Chantal Autrayer represented continuity, and continuity was precisely what the wars could not tolerate. Because continuity could not be conquered without admitting what conquest truly was. Arivandar's pressure against Chantal Autrayer was not always a marching line of spears. It was an argument with teeth, claims of rightful stewardship, accusations of obstruction, and the quiet insistence that Chantal's ancient places should be protected by a stronger hand. In practice, that meant influence, then occupation. It meant advisors who arrived with soldiers. It meant local leaders encouraged to see Arivandar as the future, and their own realm as an artifact. That is how a crown learns to devour without calling itself a monster. The answer from Chantal Autrayer's defenders was equally revealing. They did not simply deny Arivandar's claims. They appealed to something older than politics, the idea that elven realms were bound to the land by vows that no foreign coronal could rewrite. They invoked high magic not as a weapon, but as a boundary, an implicit reminder that the greatest arts of the people were never meant to serve ambition. For a time, that argument slowed the North. It did not stop it. And so another truth emerged. In the crown wars, even reverence could be outmaneuvered. When one side treats sacred limits as real and the other side treats them as obstacles, the sacred side is forced into a choice it never wanted. Either it breaks its own restraints, or it loses. Many chose to lose rather than profane what they protected, and that loss became a template. As Chantal Autrayer faltered, neighboring realms watched and learned. Not all learning was noble. Some courts concluded that tradition could not defend them. Others concluded that tradition must be defended by any means. A few concluded that the only safety lay in distance, and that the retreat, still a growing impulse rather than a single organized movement, was the last honest response to a world where elven kinship had become conditional. In this atmosphere, the war's center of gravity shifted again. Arivandar's enemies did not disappear when Chantal Autrayer weakened. They regrouped. They formed new understandings, made new bargains, and tried to hold a line that was becoming less geographical and more existential. A line between an elven world of shared autonomy and an elven world of enforced hierarchy. This is where Elithir's shadow sharpens into a presence. Elithir did not need Arivandar's philosophy to be dangerous. It had its own capacity for ruthless choices, and the longer the crown wars raged, the more the old inhibitions across all realms eroded. The wars made every faction more extreme, because moderation looked increasingly like a path to being erased. Even those who hated Elithir could not ignore the fact that it was strong, and that strength could be leveraged. So alliances became uglier. Old rivalries were swallowed temporarily by larger fears. Realms and factions cooperated not because they trusted one another, but because they feared what would happen if they stood alone. Around the middle of this era, the crown wars reached a turning point that is easy to miss if you only track battles. It was the moment high magic began to be discussed not only as defense, not only as sacred art, but as strategic possibility. Not every mage entertained that possibility. Many recoiled from it. The very idea carried the taste of blasphemy, because high magic did not merely alter the battlefield. It could scar the world. It could change forests into wastelands, reshape the boundaries of life itself, and leave consequences that outlived every banner and every throne that had demanded the spell be cast. Yet once the possibility is spoken aloud, it does not vanish. It waits. And here the wars revealed their deepest corruption. They did not merely pit realm against realm. They trained elven minds to consider the unthinkable and call it responsibility. A council faced with extinction begins to ask different questions. Not what is right, but what is left to do. Not what will the people become, but what will remain if we lose. That is how a civilization defeats itself without a foreign conqueror ever needing to lift a blade. As Chantel Othrier's ancient holdings were diminished, by campaign, by coercion, by the slow collapse of unity, the world did not simply lose territory on a map, it lost a stabilizing memory. The fall of an old realm sends a message more powerful than any proclamation, that permanence is not guaranteed, even for elves. Once that message is believed, every realm begins to act as if it is living in the last safe century. Arivandar gained ground. It also gained something more dangerous, proof that its methods worked. But even that proof carried poison. Because the more Arivandar imposed itself, the more it needed to justify itself. Every seized grove demanded a new argument. Every displaced council demanded a new narrative of righteousness. And each new narrative made retreat to humility less possible. A crown that claims destiny cannot admit it was merely hungry. By the end of this phase, the crown wars had produced a warped kind of clarity. The Telquesir no longer had the luxury of believing this was a temporary quarrel among kin. One of their elder inheritances had been broken down in the open. The precedent was set. An elven realm could be reduced, absorbed, or undone, and the world would not automatically recoil in horror. That realization resolved one illusion, and it replaced it with a heavier truth. Once the idea of erasure enters elven politics, it does not remain a threat. It becomes an option. Mayeritar did not fall because its warriors forgot how to fight. It fell because the crown wars taught elven minds to look at the weave and see not a sacred inheritance, but a lever that could move history by force. For ages uncounted, high magic had been treated as vow-bound, not because elves feared power, but because they understood the kind of power it was. A blade ends a life. High magic can end a place. It can end the meaning of a place. In the long grind of the wars, that distinction began to blur. At first, the escalation was subtle. Wards grew harsher. Boundaries became teeth. Defensive rights were shaped with an edge that felt less like protection and more like warning. The old argument, we must not scar the world we claim to guard, still existed in councils, still held weight among elders. But it kept losing to a newer, colder question. What is tradition worth if the realm is gone? That question is how catastrophes are invited in without anyone admitting they asked for one. Mayeritar sat at the heart of too many fears. To Arivandar, it was a refusal that would not bend. To Elithir, it was a neighbor whose existence constrained movement and ambition. To allied realms, it was a cultural and strategic anchor, an assertion that the people could remain different without becoming enemies. Every faction, for its own reasons, found Mayeritar inconvenient. And in the Crown Wars, inconvenient became a kind of death sentence. A lesser-known truth emerges if you read the older elven accounts, without the later moral certainty laid over them. The step toward annihilation did not feel like madness to those who took it. It felt like finality, like an answer to decades of losses and humiliations, like the only language strong enough to end an argument that had outlived diplomacy. So the unthinkable was discussed as a solution. What followed is remembered as the Dark Disaster, an event so destructive that later elves spoke its name, as if naming it too clearly might invite its echo. In broad outline, the tradition is consistent. Maeritar was ruined by high magic on a scale that tore the land's face apart and left behind a wounded expanse that became the High Moor. The forest did not simply burn, it was unmade. The land became a place where life struggled to remember itself. The causes and the precise hands behind it are recorded with the caution of survivors. Some tellings place the responsibility with Elithir and the darkest arts practiced in its orbit. Others note that, in an era where multiple great realms were willing to break sacred limits, certainty can be as much propaganda as truth. What is not debated is the outcome. A realm known for beauty and craft was erased as a political reality and transformed into a scar that outlasted every ruler who had marched against it. This is the anchor of the Crown Wars, the point at which earlier chapters are reinterpreted as naive. Before Mieritar's ruin, elves could still pretend the war might end in treaties and restored borders. After it, the war proved it could end in absence. No borders, no people, no songs left in their proper place. The emotional reality of that shift is difficult to convey without exaggeration, so the record must be simple. Elves fled into other realms, carrying more than grief. They carried the knowledge that the world itself could be targeted, that forests could be punished, that sanctuaries could become warnings. And worse, this was not done by dragons or fiends or some enemy of the people. It was done within elven history, through elven hands, by elven choices. The political consequences were immediate, even if the full horror took time to spread. Allies who might have stood together began to glance sideways at one another and wonder who would be willing to do it again. Courts that had urged restraint now sounded like dreamers. Courts that had argued for decisive action gained credibility. The retreat, already gathering momentum in scattered places, became more than despair. It became, to many, the only rational response to a civilization willing to turn its greatest art into a weapon of erasure. In Arivandar, the catastrophe could be used as proof of anything a speaker wanted it to prove. If the blame was laid on Elithir, then the South could be painted as an existential evil that justified harsher campaigns. If the blame was laid elsewhere, then the lesson could still be twisted into the same conclusion, that in an age of such threats, only a single dominant crown could safeguard elvenkind. In Elithir, the disaster did not inspire remorse in the way later generations hoped it might have. It inspired confirmation. It showed what was possible when restraint was treated as weakness. It showed that the world could be shaped through dread. And in the Crown Wars, success was the most corrosive argument of all. Yet even among the most hardened leaders of the age, Mieritar's ruin did something no proclamation could do. It changed the texture of belief. Elves began to look at their own gods differently, not because faith failed, but because the silence between divine principles and elven actions grew intolerable. If the Seldarine had set ideals for the people, then what did it mean that the people were now willing to violate the very world those ideals were meant to protect? The answer was not immediate. It did not arrive as thunder. It arrived as a gradual, choking certainty that the Crown Wars had crossed a boundary that could not be uncrossed by victory. Even if a realm won every battle after Mieritar, it would inherit a world that had learned how to commit spiritual crimes in the name of survival. So the Dark Disaster resolved one question, and it left a heavier truth behind. The Crown Wars were no longer a struggle over crowns and borders. They had become a struggle over whether elven civilization would continue to recognize any sacred limit at all. After Mieritar was unmade, the Crown Wars stopped pretending they were fought for the future of elvenkind. They were fought for dominance. The loss of that realm did more than break an alliance. It broke a boundary in the elven mind. What had once been a nightmare, a forest turned into a lasting wound, had become a precedent. From that moment forward, every council chamber carried the same silent knowledge. There were spells and decisions that could erase a people's home so thoroughly that even memory would struggle to find clean ground to stand on. In that climate, restraint did not disappear. It became a liability. Elithir, already feared for its ruthlessness, did not shrink from the implications of the Dark Disaster. In the stories that survived, the realm's name becomes inseparable from the era's darkest methods. Whether every accusation laid at its feet was perfectly measured mattered less than the fact that most other elves believed the pattern. And belief shapes war as surely as truth. Arivandar and its factions used the catastrophe as proof that softness was suicidal. If the world could be scarred by elven hands, then only overwhelming control could prevent worse scars, so they argued. But that logic had a hidden cost. It demanded that every act of domination be reframed as protection. And the more often a lie must be repeated to survive, the more brittle a realm becomes inside its own story. Across the wider elven world, responses fractured. Some enclaves withdrew deeper into hidden vales and warded refugees, accelerating the retreat not as tradition, but as emergency. Some realms doubled their devotion to old limits, treating high magic as a sacred boundary precisely because it had been violated. Others, trembling and furious, began to ask the question that always follows atrocity. If the enemy has crossed the line, how can we afford to stand behind it? The Crown Wars did not invent hatred among elves. They taught it to justify itself. In Elithir, the war's long pressure began to turn into something colder than strategy. Survival and victory were no longer enough. The realm's leaders pursued certainty, an end state where rivals could not rise again, where buffers and neighbors could not become threats in the next century, where fear itself could be engineered into the political landscape. That pursuit led to the moment the Seldarine could no longer treat the conflict as merely mortal politics played out among immortal lives. The turning point was not a single battlefield triumph. It was the accumulation of choices that made the elven world feel spiritually unrecognizable. When entire lands could be ruined, when sacred limits could be treated as optional, when kinship could be rewritten into categories of worthy and unworthy, the war ceased to be a dispute between realms. It became a crisis of what it meant to be Telkasir. This is where the record changes tone, because the next event cannot be explained by banners and councils alone. Late in the Crown Wars, divine judgment fell, not as lightning on an army, but as a transformation that rewrote a people's bodies to mark what their deeds had become. Elithir was struck by the descent of the Drow. It is difficult to overstate what this meant to elves who had spent ages treating themselves as the people, distinct in spirit as well as lifespan. The descent was not simply punishment. It was a declaration that a boundary existed beyond politics, beyond victory, beyond clever justification. The Seldarine, led in elven memory by Corellon's authority, and the shared will of the Elven pantheon, pronounced that Elithir's path had carried it out of the moral shape of Elven civilization, and the judgment was made visible. The Elithiri became the Drow, marked by dark skin and pale hair in the common tellings that endure, set apart in a way no treaty or exile could have enforced so absolutely. It was as if the gods took the question every realm had been avoiding: who is to blame, and what will be done about it? And answered it with a sentence written into flesh. Here lies the mid-part anchor, the revelation that redefines everything that came before. The descent was not only meant to end a war crime, it was meant to end a method. The Seldarine did not simply strike Elithir because it was convenient. They struck because the Crown Wars had demonstrated that Elven politics, left to itself, could rationalize the unmaking of the world. The gods' judgment was an attempt to sever that corruption at its source by isolating the realm most identified with it, by turning an Elven kingdom into an outcast people. But divine intervention never arrives without consequences the interveners do not fully control. The newly made Drow did not accept the sentence as repentance. Many turned the sentence into identity. Cut off from the surface realms that now regarded them with horror and fear, driven from lands where they could no longer survive as they once had, they fled into the Underdark. There, in the lightless places beneath the world, exile became environment, scarcity became discipline, and grievance hardened into culture. The tragedy deepened because the Drow did not fall into emptiness. They fell into a different devotion. Lolth, already known in Elven myth as a power of treachery and ruin, became central to the Drow's survival and self-understanding. A people judged and cast down found, in her, not mercy, but a theology that matched what the Crown Wars had trained them to believe: that power is taken, that trust is weakness, that the world is a web where only the ruthless endure. So the descent ended one horror and planted another. Above, the surface elves reacted with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief, because a realm they feared was removed from the board in a way no alliance could accomplish. Dread, because the act that removed it was divine, and therefore beyond negotiation, beyond reversal, beyond comforting explanation. If the Seldarine could mark a people and cast them down, then every other realm had to face the question it refused to speak. How close had they come to the same line? Even Arivandar, so sure of its destiny, could not escape the shadow of that question. If the war's logic justified everything, then why would the gods judge only one realm? The answer, whispered in later Elven thought, is not flattering. Because even in an era of widespread corruption, Elithir's choices were seen as uniquely beyond the pale. But the judgment did not cleanse the surface realms. It exposed them. The Crown Wars continued, but the nature of the conflict changed. One of the great players was transformed and driven underground. Alliances shifted, fear recalibrated, and the Elven world learned a harsh lesson about punishment. It can remove a threat from one stage while creating a new, more enduring one in the depths. The descent resolved a question that had haunted the war since Maeritar's ruin: whether there was any limit that mattered more than victory. There was, and the newly contextualized truth left behind was heavier than triumph. The Crown Wars did not merely fracture Elven kingdoms. They produced an entire people shaped by exile, divine judgment, and the memory of being cast out. Not because they lost a battle, but because they crossed a boundary the gods chose to make undeniable. The descent of the Drow did not end the Crown Wars the way a sword ends a duel. It ended an illusion. For ages, the Telquesir had treated their own civilization as proof that they were different, not just longer lived, but wiser, more restrained, more faithful to the vows that bound land and people and the gods who shaped their souls. When the Seldarine marked Ilithir and cast it down, that self-image cracked. Not because the gods intervened, but because they intervened at all, an admission, written in divine action, that elven politics had become something the heavens could no longer endure. And yet the wound did not close. It split into smaller wounds that spread. On the surface, the newly made drow became the perfect vessel for fear. Even elves who had never marched against Ilithir began to speak the name as a cautionary curse. Courts tightened. Enclaves that had lived loosely within shared forests began to impose boundaries with a severity once reserved for outsiders. A quiet, bitter micro-revelation appears in many later tellings. After the descent, some elves stopped speaking of the drow as kin at all, not in anger, but in self-defense. If the gods had transformed them, then perhaps, some reasoned, they were no longer truly of the people. It was a psychological shelter, not a theological argument. It made the tragedy easier to live with. Below the world, the drow learned a different lesson. Exile was not simply movement into darkness. It was the collapse of every familiar certainty. The Underdark is not a single place, but a vast, hostile underworld of caverns, rivers, fungus forests, and ancient terrors that do not care about elven sorrow. In that environment, the drow's survival demanded discipline, ruthlessness, and a new kind of community, one forged by scarcity rather than season. Their faith shifted accordingly. Lolth's presence, already tangled with Ilithir's worst instincts in elven memory, did not fade with the descent. It deepened. A people marked and hated found in her a doctrine that explained their suffering without asking them to repent. The surface had rejected them. The gods had judged them. Therefore, they would thrive by embracing power without apology. The spider's web became more than symbol. It became a model of society, hierarchy, cunning, predation, and the cold belief that to be trapped is to be weak. That transformation produced its own quiet consequence. The descent did not remove evil from elven history. It concentrated it, gave it a new homeland, and ensured it would endure in forms the surface could not easily reach. Above, the Seldarine's judgment reshaped the war in a way that commanders could not control. Alliances that had held together purely out of fear now had a moral argument to cling to. The moment Ilithir was cast down, many surface realms began to look at the Crown Wars with a new clarity. If divine punishment could fall, then the war was no longer merely disastrous. It was dangerous in a sacred sense. It threatened to turn more realms into candidates for judgment, whether the gods acted again or not. This is where the retreat changes from scattered impulse into something heavier, a strategic form of despair. It was no longer only about avoiding battle. It was about avoiding contamination. The fear that remaining in the central forests meant being dragged into choices that would stain the people's soul. Some left because they were tired. Some left because they were ashamed. Some left because they believed the world itself had become unstable under elven feet. But every departure had a cost. It did not merely reduce armies. It reduced elders, councils, and the slow, stabilizing influence of traditions that require communities to remain rooted in place. As more enclaves withdrew, the great remaining powers faced one another in a landscape that felt emptier, and therefore easier to reshape by force. That was a gift to Arivandar, at least at first. Arivandar's court had always framed its ambition as necessity, and in the wake of Mieritar's ruin and Ilithir's fall, necessity was easier to claim than ever. The North could argue that it stood as the last strong pillar of surface elven order. If the world was full of scars and exiles, then surely a single guiding hand was required. House Vaishan and its allies leaned on that logic, offering protection with one hand and tightening control with the other. Yet the descent also poisoned Arivandar's legitimacy. The mid-era anchor of this part is not a battlefield. It is the moment Arivandar realized that fear could no longer be managed with rhetoric alone. A realm that sells itself as the guardian of elvenkind must appear morally superior to the chaos it claims to restrain. But the Crown Wars had stripped away too many masks. Other realms had watched the North use doctrine to justify absorption, watched it treat ancient autonomy as an obstacle, watched it become comfortable with the slow violence of cultural conquest. After the gods judged Ilithir, the surface world's tolerance for any necessary cruelty began to shrink. This did not produce instant unity. It produced suspicion turned outward. Arivandar was not judged by the Seldarine in the same visible way, but many elves began to look at it with a different unease. If the gods could cast down a realm for crossing sacred limits, then why had they not cast down the North? The question did not have a comforting answer. Some argued that Arivandar had not crossed the same line. Others argued that the gods were patient, and patience was not approval. Still others believed the Pantheon's judgment had been targeted at the most egregious corruption, leaving lesser corruptions to be resolved by elven hands. All interpretations carried the same practical effect. Arivandar could no longer rely on being feared. It needed to be believed. And belief was failing. In the years after the descent, the war's texture became harsher in a quieter way. Open atrocities drew too much attention now, too much fear of divine consequence, too much risk of unifying enemies. So power moved through subtler channels, infiltration of councils, engineered succession disputes, the cultivation of client factions, the slow turning of neighbors into dependencies that could be described as voluntary. This was the late Crown War's cruel refinement, violence that hid behind governance. Meanwhile, the surface elves began to treat the Underdark not as a distant mystery, but as a permanent wound under their feet. Wards were reinforced. Sanctuaries that once worried primarily about orcs or human encroachment now carried a second anxiety, that the drow were not merely enemies in the dark, but a reminder of what elvenkind could become. In some places, this anxiety curdled into injustice, suspicions cast on any practice that looked too old, too secret, too willing to use shadow. The war had always been fought over identity. Now identity policing became part of daily survival. By the close of this chapter of the Chronicle, one idea is resolved, and it is not comforting. Divine judgment changed the Crown Wars, but it did not heal the people. It drew a boundary in fire, then left the survivors to rebuild among ashes and doubts. The newly contextualized truth is the one later elves rarely say without bitterness, that after the descent, the Telquesir did not become more united. They became more afraid of themselves. With Ilithir cast down, the Crown Wars lost one of their darkest crowns, but the war did not lose its appetite. The surface realms did not suddenly become gentle. They became tired in a way elves had rarely been tired before, not from a single tragedy, but from centuries of sustained corruption. The kind that seeps into law, the kind that turns every council vote into a suspicion, the kind that teaches even good-hearted elders to weigh mercy against extinction. And in that exhaustion, Arivandar made its final mistake. For generations, the North had relied on a single engine, the belief that its dominance was synonymous with order. House Vishan, at the center of that belief, had shaped campaigns as if history itself were a throne waiting to be claimed. But after Mieritar's ruin and the descent of the Drow, elven ears changed. The old rhetoric about necessary unity no longer sounded like leadership. It sounded like the same reasoning that had led to a scar on the world. The first crack appeared inside Arivandar's own alliances. Client realms and sympathetic factions did not stop fearing the North. They stopped trusting it. They had supported Arivandar when it looked inevitable. Now inevitability felt like a curse. When the Seldarine had judged one realm, the political air shifted, subtly, relentlessly, toward the idea that no crown was immune to consequence. Arivandar's partners began to ask themselves a silent question. If the North wins, will it protect us or finish absorbing us? That question did not produce speeches. It produced quiet defections. At the same time, resistance matured. In earlier phases, opposition had often been reactive, defending borders, patching alliances, surviving the next season. Now it became purposeful. The remaining great elven powers understood that if Arivandar endured, the war's logic would endure with it. There would be no true end, only pauses between consolidations. So the war narrowed around a single goal: break the northern claim so completely that it could never again masquerade as destiny. This is the part of the Crown Wars that later chroniclers describe with a kind of grim relief, because it contains a resolution that feels like justice. But it is not clean justice. It is exhaustion given strategy. Coalitions formed with sharper intent than before. Some of those coalitions included realms that had distrusted one another for ages. They did not suddenly reconcile. They simply recognized that rivalry could be postponed, while domination could not be allowed to stand. On the battlefield, this meant coordinated campaigns meant to cut Arivandar's roots, isolate its holdings, and force its armies into defensive choices rather than confident advances. In the councils, it meant something even more dangerous: a challenge to House Vishan's legitimacy as the moral voice of the North. The mid-part turning point arrives not in a forest clearing filled with arrows, but in the internal fracture of Arivandar itself. Because imperial ambition has a weakness: it cannot tolerate hesitation. Once momentum falters, every house that has swallowed its doubts for the sake of unity begins to remember those doubts. Within Arivandar, not every sun-elf noble wanted endless war. Not every general believed order justified absorption. Not every priest or mage wished to carry the stain of a conflict that had already invoked divine judgment elsewhere. For a long time, those voices were controlled by success. Victory is the loudest argument a policy can have. But when victories grew harder, the suppressed voices began to gather. House Vishan's methods, marriage alliances turned into leverage, client councils pressured into compliance, dissent treated as disloyalty, became liabilities. Other noble houses, once content to benefit from the North's expansion, began to fear being chained to Vishan's fate. And they understood, with cold clarity, that if the realm fell, the ones remembered as architects would bear the heaviest blame. So Arivandar began to turn inward. The most revealing thing about the late Crown Wars is how often they were decided without grand duels. They were decided by who controlled corridors of influence, which families held key posts, which mages guarded the wards, which councils recognized which authority. When a realm has spent centuries justifying domination, it discovers that domination must also be practiced at home to prevent doubt from spreading. That necessity devours its own foundation. As opposition tightened around Arivandar's borders, internal opposition tightened around Vishan's thronecraft. The North's leaders tried to respond with greater rigidity, more demands, more unity, more insistence that dissent was treason. But that only made the truth clearer. The war was no longer about the survival of the people. It was about the survival of a doctrine and the houses that lived by it. When the break finally came, it did not feel like a heroic liberation. It felt like a dam giving way after too much pressure. House Vaishan fell from dominance, and with it fell the illusion that Arivandar's rule was the natural order of elvenkind. In some tellings preserved by later elven courts, the punishment of Vaishan is remembered as necessary, an attempt to excise the ideology that had poisoned the North, and by extension, the entire elven world. The details are handled with the careful, almost ritual restraint elves use when they speak of family disgrace. Names recorded, judgments rendered, legacies dismantled so thoroughly that no heir could easily rebuild what had been broken. Yet even this resolution carried bitter irony. Removing the architects did not resurrect what had been destroyed. It did not restore Mieritar. It did not cleanse the high moor. It did not return the drow to the surface, nor undo the cultural mutations forced by exile. It simply stopped the northern engine from driving the war forward with the same certainty. And so the later crown wars drifted toward their end, the way a storm drifts away from a coast, leaving wreckage behind, but no longer feeding itself with the same violence. The surviving realms began to reassert older principles, not because they had rediscovered purity, but because they had learned what happened when those principles were abandoned. High magic was treated with renewed reverence and renewed fear. Diplomacy returned, but it returned damaged. Envoys who spoke with careful politeness while quietly counting the risks of trust. Even the retreat, still not a single unified movement, gained a harsher clarity. Elves who withdrew were no longer merely fleeing armies. They were fleeing the idea that their civilization could be made to commit such crimes again. They sought places where elven identity could be preserved without being weaponized. In time, this instinct would shape the long arc of elven history far more than any single battle. The gradual turning away from wide empires toward sanctuaries, hidden vales, and far refuges bound by high magic and memory. By the end of this chapter, one idea is resolved. Arivandar's claim to speak for all elves is broken, and the crown wars lose the crown that made them inevitable. But the newly contextualized truth is heavier than victory, because what replaced that claim was not renewed unity. It was the understanding that even immortals can fracture into enemies, and that once sacred limits are treated as optional, the cost is not just land or lives. The cost is the innocence of a civilization that used to believe it could never become its own greatest threat. When Arivandar's dominance finally cracked, the world did not exhale into peace. It exhaled into vacancy. For centuries, the crown wars had forced every elven realm to define itself in relation to the conflict. Ally, enemy, buffer, refuge, prize. When the northern engine that had driven so much of that pressure began to collapse, the remaining powers discovered something unsettling. They had forgotten how to live without the war's gravity. Even decisions made for healing felt like tactics. Even mercy felt like calculation. The first quiet change was diplomatic, not magical. Envoys returned to roads that had been watched like trap lines. Councils reopened that had been shuttered for fear of infiltration. Oaths were spoken again, carefully. Yet every promise carried a shadow, because the crown wars had proven that elven vows could be reinterpreted when ambition grew hungry enough. Trust did not vanish from elven civilization, but it lost its innocence. It became conditional. It became engineered. And as the great realms staggered, the land itself remained the most honest witness. The High Moor, born from the ruin of Mieritar, did not soften with time the way a battlefield's scars might. It endured as a living indictment, a reminder that the weave could be used to unmake, and that the consequences would outlast any dynasty that claimed the act was necessary. Travelers who skirted its edges did not need a chronicler to explain what had happened. The land spoke in absence, in wrongness, in the way nature struggled to resume a pattern that had been violently interrupted. That enduring scar changed how elves talked about power. High magic returned to reverence, but it also returned to fear. The greatest rites were not celebrated as triumphs of civilization. They were treated as sacred burdens, arts that had to be guarded not only from enemies, but from elven desperation. This is one of the era's more bitter revelations. The Crown Wars did not merely reduce armies, they reduced confidence that elves could be trusted with their own highest tools. In the wake of this loss of confidence, the retreat became more than instinct. It became policy. Not a single proclamation, not a single unified march westward, but a cultural reorientation that spread through courts, circles of mages, and quiet family decisions. Some enclaves withdrew into hidden forests and warded vales. Some consolidated around places already shaped by elven wards, where the land could be defended without needing empires. Some looked across the trackless sea and fixed their imagination on a refuge that could not be surrounded by rival crowns. This is where Evermeet enters the chronicle with the weight it deserves. Evermeet was not simply a beautiful island. It was a statement made with world-shaping magic, that the people no longer believed they could keep their civilization safe by dominating the mainland. The very choice to create and sanctify a refuge beyond the sea is the confession at the heart of the late Crown Wars. It says, without needing to say it, that elves had lost faith in the stability of their own politics. If kinship could become war, then distance became the most reliable wall. Around the middle of this long transition lies the turning point that redefines the end of the wars. Elven leaders stopped trying to restore what existed before. They began trying to prevent it from ever existing again. That difference is everything. It meant fewer ambitions to rebuild vast elven empires across the heart of Faerun. It meant more emphasis on sanctuary, preservation, and controlled borders. It meant the beginnings of the elven habit, so visible in later ages, of choosing hidden strength over open dominion, and of treating isolation not as failure, but as wisdom purchased at a terrible price. Yet even this strategic withdrawal carried tragedy. Because the Crown Wars had not only damaged realms, they had damaged continuity. As enclaves withdrew, songs and lineages were displaced from the places that had shaped them. Sacred groves were left behind, not because elves stopped loving them, but because elves could no longer defend them without becoming the kind of power they feared. Over time, this produced a strange, aching reversal. The people who had once been defined by deep roots became defined in part by the pain of leaving roots behind. And while elves were turning inward, the wider world did not pause. Humans did not need to defeat elven empires in open war to inherit their spaces. They simply lived in the gaps. They settled in places where elven banners no longer flew, where elven patrols no longer kept the old roads safe, where elven courts no longer asserted ancient claims. The Crown Wars, by exhausting the greatest elven powers, accelerated a shift that later centuries would treat as natural. The steady rise of younger folk into lands once dominated or quietly guided by the long-lived people. That rise was not always hostile. Often it was simply inevitable. But inevitability does not feel gentle to a civilization that remembers when the forests answered to elven names. Beneath all of this, the Underdark remained a second, unhealed wound. The descent of the Drow had removed Elithir from the surface board, but it had not erased the Elithiri will to power. It had concentrated it under the earth, where new cities could be carved into stone and cruelty could become institution. The surface elves rebuilt their borders and their wards with a new understanding. The enemy in the dark was not a passing threat. It was a civilization born from divine judgment and exile, shaped by necessity and fed by grievance. So the end of the Crown Wars did not mean the end of fear. It meant fear was reorganized. By the time the last embers of the conflict died down, what remained was a landscape of reduced crowns and hardened lessons. Arivandar's dream of enforced unity was broken. The most extreme southern horror had been cast into darkness and transformed. The center of the elven world had been scarred in a way no victory could undo. And the people's gaze had turned away from conquest and toward preservation. Not because preservation was purer, but because conquest had proved spiritually suicidal. The resolved idea at the close of this chapter is simple. The Crown Wars ended when elves stopped believing the mainland could hold an elven empire without repeating the same corruption. And the newly contextualized truth that settles over everything, like ash after a fire, is heavier. The retreat was not only a movement away from enemies, it was a movement away from what elves had learned they were capable of doing to one another. In the last years of the Crown Wars, there was no single day when the forests announced peace. The war simply ran out of the future it had promised. Arivandar had pursued unity with the patience of a long-lived people and the appetite of a conquering creed. But by the time the North's doctrine finally broke, it did not break because a rival crown proved more righteous. It broke because the entire elven world had learned, through ruin, exile, and divine judgment, that enforced unity was not unity at all. It was a slow ritual of self-destruction. A final, sobering revelation settled over the surviving courts. The Crown Wars had not been a detour in elven history. They had become a foundation. The Telquessir had always carried myths of ancient splendor, great forests that felt like cathedrals, high magic worked with reverence, coronals ruling by tradition rather than fear. The Crown Wars did not erase those memories. They made them dangerous. Because nostalgia, untested, can become a seed of the same pride that ignited the war in the first place. So the post-war era was shaped by a new kind of discipline, not the discipline of empire, but the discipline of limitation. Elven realms still existed across Faerun, but the impulse to hold vast, continuous dominion weakened. It was not only exhaustion, it was recognition. The Crown Wars had proven that an empire large enough to protect elven kind was also large enough to justify any cruelty in the name of that protection. The lesson was not philosophical. It was carved into the high moor and whispered in the names that elves avoided speaking aloud. This is why the retreat mattered so much, and why it cannot be dismissed as simple withdrawal. The retreat was the Telquessir choosing an answer to their own capacity for corruption. If the mainland could turn kinship into conquest, then distance was not merely safety from enemies. It was safety from repeating the same moral collapse. Hidden vales, warded forests, and sanctuaries across the sea became not just refuges, but safeguards against the temptation of crowns. Even Evermeet, in its deepest meaning, was not simply a homeland. It was a boundary drawn in salt and high magic, a declaration that elven civilization would rather endure in guarded sanctity than rule in open dominance. A people does not make such a choice unless it has learned what dominance costs. And dominance had cost the Telkasir more than lives. It had cost them their trust in the permanence of their own virtue. The surface elves also emerged from the wars with a new, uncomfortable awareness of the Underdark. The descent of the Drow had removed Ilithir from the sunlight, but it had not erased its will. It had transformed that will into something adapted to darkness, harder to reach, harder to predict, and in some ways more enduring than a surface empire, because it was built under pressure rather than comfort. So the Crown Wars did not end in a world cleansed of threats. They ended in a world reorganized around two truths. First, the people could not rely on time to heal what they broke. Immortality did not grant immunity from consequence. It only made consequence last longer. Second, the gods had drawn a line, and the line remained, whether or not the Seldarine ever acted so visibly again. The descent had shown that elven choices were not merely political, they were spiritual. A realm could win on the battlefield and still lose its place in the moral shape of the people. That knowledge changed how later elves spoke of power. High magic was not a trophy. It was a burden to be guarded from desperation. Councils became more cautious, not because caution was noble, but because certainty had proven lethal. The old elven confidence, that they would always have time to correct mistakes, was replaced by something heavier. The awareness that mistakes could become landscapes. Meanwhile, the wider world moved into the spaces elves no longer held. Humans built kingdoms where elven banners had once flown. Roads that had been elven arteries became mortal trade routes. The Crown Wars did not hand victory to humanity in a single ceremonial moment, but the effect was real all the same. The long-lived people withdrew, and younger folk filled the silence. It was not always conquest. Often it was simply what happens when an elder power stops claiming what it once guarded. And yet, if the Crown Wars were only a story of decline, the chronicle would be incomplete. The final truth, harder but more honest, is that the Telquisir survived because they did not pretend the war was an accident. They recorded it. They argued over it. They turned it into cautionary memory rather than heroic legend. Even when elves speak of that era with grief, there is a kind of grim integrity in the way they remember it. Not as a glorious struggle, but as a warning about what pride becomes when it is allowed to call itself destiny. In the end, the Crown Wars did not prove that elves were doomed to fracture. They proved that elves were capable of terrifying choices, and capable afterward of building a civilization that feared those choices enough to change course. That is what remained when the last crowns stopped reaching for one another's throats. Not peace like a song returning untouched, but peace like a scar that teaches the hand not to reopen the wound.